What if one of the oldest prison diaries in history wasn't about survival, but about the future of the entire world? What if the visions written by a captive thousands of years ago were not fading relics of the past, but a message aimed directly at us? Tonight, we step into that story. The story begins. Far from home, behind the walls of a foreign empire, a young man sat in silence. No throne, no army, no freedom, just stone walls and a future he never asked for. His name was Daniel. He was not born into prophecy. He did not grow up expecting to speak for God. He was simply a young man taken from his homeland when the great empire of Babylon conquered his people. One day he was living in Jerusalem among his own nation. The next, he was marched across deserts, stripped of identity, and trained to serve the very empire that destroyed his home. The world he knew vanished overnight. But what Daniel lost in security, he gained in something far more mysterious. A front-row seat to history and a glimpse beyond it. A book that was never meant to be comfortable. There are many stories in the Bible that inspire hope, but Daniel's story doesn't begin that way. It begins with exile, with uncertainty, with the unsettling realization that faith does not always protect us from hardship. Yet in that uncertainty, something extraordinary happened. The young captive began receiving visions, not ordinary dreams, not symbolic poetry, but vivid, unsettling images of kingdoms rising and falling, rulers gaining power, wars shaking nations, and a timeline stretching far beyond his lifetime. Imagine the weight of that. A man who could not even choose where he lived was suddenly seeing the direction of history itself. Daniel wasn't trying to change the world. That's part of what makes his story so compelling. Daniel wasn't revolutionary. He wasn't trying to overthrow Babylon. He wasn't even trying to become famous. All he wanted was to remain faithful to God in a place that worshipped everything else. But faithfulness placed him in moments that shaped empires. He interpreted dreams for kings. He advised rulers. He watched political shifts from the inside. And in quiet moments, often alone, he recorded what he believed God was showing him. Those writings would later become some of the most debated prophetic texts in history, not because they were vague, but because they seemed almost too precise. Why Daniel's story still feels personal. At first glance, Daniel's world feels distant. Ancient cities, royal courts, foreign gods, stone temples. But look closer, and something surprising appears. Daniel lived in a time of rapid political change. Nations shifted. Cultures blended. New technologies reshaped communication and power. People wonder where history was heading. That doesn't sound ancient. That sounds familiar. Because every generation feels like it's standing at a turning point. And Daniel's writings don't just describe events. They describe a pattern of human ambition, fear, and search for meaning. A pattern that repeats itself again and again. The weight of seeing too much. One of the most striking details in Daniel's story is not the visions themselves. It's his reaction to them. He wasn't triumphant. He wasn't excited. He was shaken. The text described him as troubled, pale, even physically drained after some of the visions. Why? Because what he saw wasn't just the rise of kingdoms. It was a realization that history is moving towards something inevitable, and that realization can be uncomfortable. We like to think the future is wide open, that humanity is improvising its way forward. But Daniel's writing suggests something else, that history may be unfolding along a path far more deliberate than we imagine, a message hidden in plain sight. For centuries, Daniel's writings have fascinated scholars, believers, skeptics, and historians alike. Some read them as symbolic literature. Some see them as spiritual warnings. Others see them as a coded map of history. But no matter how someone interprets them, one fact stands out. Daniel's story is not about predicting the future just for curiosity's sake. It's about perspective. It asks a simple but uncomfortable question. If history is moving somewhere, what does that mean for how we live today? The human side of the story. It's easy to forget that Daniel wasn't a legend when he lived. He was a young immigrant trying to survive in a foreign culture. He learned a new language. He adapted to a new political system. He served leaders who didn't share his beliefs. In other words, he lived the kind of life many people understand today. And that's what makes his story feel less like mythology and more like a mirror. Because at its heart, Daniel's journey is about staying grounded when everything around you changes, about holding on to identity when culture pressures you to let it go, about choosing conviction over convenience. Those themes are timeless. Why this story still matters. In a world overflowing with information, people still ask the same questions Daniel's generation asked. Where's history going? Does anything truly last? Is there meaning beyond the rise and fall of nations? Daniel's writings don't offer easy answers. Instead, they offer a lens. They invite readers to see history not as random chaos, but as a story moving toward a destination. Whether someone reads it spiritually, historically, or symbolically, the idea itself is powerful. Because if history has direction, then our choices inside that history matter. From ancient cell to modern audience. Think about the journey of Daniel's words. Written by a captive in a foreign empire, preserved through centuries of war and translation, read today by millions across cultures and languages. Few stories travel that far. And even fewer still spark the kind of reflection Daniel's writings continue to provoke. They challenge us to look at the world not just as it is, but as part of something larger, a narrative still unfolding, a doorway into the larger story. And this is where our journey really begins. Because Daniel's life is only the opening scene. The visions he recorded, the symbols he described, the patterns he hinted at, they form the foundation for a much bigger conversation. A conversation about history, faith, human nature, and hope. So before we move forward, pause for a moment. Imagine that young captive once more, sitting in a quiet room in Babylon, writing by lamplight. He doesn't know who will read his words. He doesn't know how long they will last. But he writes anyway, because he believes the message isn't just for his time. It's for anyone willing to listen. Transition into the body section. And that brings us to the next step in our journey. Because to understand why Daniel's writings still resonate today, we need to explore what he actually saw, what those visions meant in his world, and why people continue to revisit them centuries later. So now, let's step beyond the introduction and begin unfolding the deeper story behind Daniel's visions. So now we step deeper into Daniel's world. Not just a young exile trying to survive in Babylon, but the man who began to realize that his life was being woven into something far bigger than politics, survival, or personal faith. Because Daniel's story is not just about what he believed. It's about what he saw, and what he saw would outlive empires. The night the future knocked on the door. It didn't begin with Daniel searching for visions. It began with a king who couldn't sleep. The ruler of Babylon, powerful beyond imagination, was haunted by a dream so vivid it shook him awake in fear. This was Nebuchadnezzar II, a man used to commanding armies and shaping history. Yet in that moment, he was helpless before something invisible. He demanded that his wise men explain the dream. But there was a problem. He wouldn't tell them what the dream was. He wanted proof that their wisdom was real. If they could not reveal both the dream and its meaning, they would be executed. Panic spread through the royal court. The decree extended even to the young Hebrew captives, including Daniel. Suddenly, the quiet exile found himself facing death, not for anything he had done, but because the king demanded answers no human could invent. Faith in the face of the impossible. Daniel's response is one of the most human moments in the entire story. He didn't pretend to have instant answers. He didn't boast about spiritual power. He asked for time. And that night, he did something simple but profound. He prayed, not as a ritual, not as a performance, but as someone who genuinely believed God was listening. The story tells us that during the night, the mystery was revealed to him. Imagine the weight of waking up knowing you hold the answer that could spare lives and shape the king's understanding of history itself. Daniel was brought before Nebuchadnezzar, and instead of claiming credit, he began with humility. He told the king no human wisdom could reveal such things. Only God could. Then he described the dream, the statue that told the story of empires. Nebuchadnezzar had seen a colossal statue. Its head was gold. Its chest and arms were silver. Its belly and thighs were bronze. Its legs were iron. Its feet were iron mixed with clay. And then, in the dream, something unexpected happened. A stone, not carved by human hands, struck the statue and shattered it completely. The fragments blew away like dust. but the stone grew into a mountain that filled the whole earth. Why this dream was so disturbing? Daniel explained that the statue represented a sequence of kingdoms. Babylon itself was a golden head, powerful, radiant, unmatched in its time. But after would come other kingdoms, each different in character, some stronger, some more divided. History would move forward through empires, conflicts, and shifting powers, until finally, something entirely different would appear, a kingdom not built by human ambition, not formed by conquest, not sustained by political strength, a kingdom established by God. This idea shook Nebuchadnezzar, because for the first time, the most powerful man on earth was forced to confront a truth he had never considered. His empire was not the final chapter. It was only one page in a much longer story. When power meets humility, Nebuchadnezzar's reaction was astonishing. Instead of punishing Daniel, he honored him. The young exile was promoted, given authority, and placed among the rulers of the province. But Daniel's life did not suddenly become easy, because influence brings attention, and attention brings tension. Serving in a foreign empire meant constantly walking a tightrope between loyalty to the king and loyalty to God. That tension would define the rest of the story. The fire that tested conviction. One of the most dramatic moments connected to Daniel's circle did not involve Daniel directly. It involved his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Nebuchadnezzar, still intoxicated by power, built a massive golden statue and commanded everyone to bow before it. The symbolism was clear. If the dream suggested kingdoms would pass away, the king wanted to prove his glory would endure. But Daniel's friends refused to bow. They weren't rebellious. They weren't political agitators. They simply believed their worship belonged to God alone. The punishment was immediate, a furnace heated beyond normal limits. Yet the story tells us something astonishing. When they were thrown into the flames, they were not consumed. Witnesses claimed to see a fourth figure in the fire, walking beside them. Whether interpreted as miracle, divine intervention, or a symbol of God's presence, the moment became unforgettable. It showed that faith in the story is never abstract. It always comes with real consequences. Daniel's own test would come. Years passed. Kings rose and fell. Empires shifted leadership. Daniel grew older, but his reputation for wisdom only deepened. Eventually, under a new ruler, jealousy among officials led to a plot. They realized Daniel's integrity made it impossible to accuse him of corruption, so they attacked the one place they knew he would not compromise, his faith. A decree was issued forbidding prayer to anyone except the king. Daniel knew the law, he knew the risk, and he prayed anyway, not dramatically, not secretly, simply faithfully, as he always had. The lion's den. The punishment was brutal and final. Daniel was thrown into a den of lions. The scene is so famous, it's easy to forget how terrifying it must have been. No music, no narration, just darkness, the sound of animals breathing, and a man who knew he had chosen conviction over safety. Yet the story tells us the lions did not harm him. By morning, the king himself rushed to the den, hoping against hope that Daniel had survived. When he heard Daniel's voice answering from below, relief swept through the court. Daniel was lifted out unharmed. And once again, the message was clear. Faithfulness in this story is not about avoiding danger. It's about trusting God in the middle of it. But the visions were still coming. If Daniel's story ended with the lion's den, it would already be remarkable. But the most mysterious parts of his life were still unfolding. Because as he aged, Daniel began receiving visions of his own. These weren't dreams for kings. They were revelations given directly to him. They came in symbols. Beasts rising from the sea, horns representing rulers, conflicts unfolding across generations. To modern readers, these images can feel strange or cryptic, but in the ancient world, symbolic visions were understood as a way of describing spiritual realities behind political events. Daniel wasn't just seeing kingdoms. He was seeing the deeper struggle between human power and divine purpose. A man overwhelmed by what he saw. What makes Daniel's vision so compelling is his reaction. He wasn't triumphant. He wasn't eager to publish predictions. He was exhausted by what he saw. One passage describes him as physically weakened for days, because the visions weren't just about glory. They included suffering, conflict, and long periods of waiting before restoration. Daniel realized something profound. History does not move in a straight line toward peace. It moves through tension, testing, and transformation. Why people still return to Daniel's story? Across centuries, Daniel's writings have fascinated readers, not because they answer every question, but because they force us to ask better ones. They invite us to look at history as more than random events, to consider whether there is meaning behind the rise and fall of nations, to wonder whether human power is truly the final authority, and perhaps most importantly, they ask what faith looks like when the world keeps changing. Daniel's life suggests that faith isn't about predicting outcomes. It's about remaining anchored while history moves around you, the thread running through everything. If we step back from the details, a pattern emerges. Every major moment in Daniel's story follows the same rhythm. A crisis appears. Faith is tested. God reveals something deeper. It's a rhythm that turns Daniel's life from a series of events into a unified message. Empires change. Rulers rise. Circumstances shift. But faithfulness in this narrative remains constant. And that's what makes the story feel timeless. Because every generation faces its own version of that tension. The question is never just what's happening in the world. The question is who we become while it happens, where the story leads next. By the time Daniel's life draws toward its final chapters, he understands something he couldn't have known as a young exile. His story was never only about survival in Babylon. It was about witnessing how God works across generations, not just moments. The visions he recorded weren't meant to satisfy curiosity. They were meant to point beyond themselves, toward hope, toward restoration, toward a future where human empires are not the final word. And that realization prepares us for what comes next. Because the closing part of Daniel's story isn't really an ending. It's a reflection, a chance to step back and ask what all of this means, not just for ancient kings or exiles, but for anyone reading the story today. And that's where we turn next. The story that leads to a decision. There's something unsettling about watching a story unfold when you already know how it ends. It changes the way you listen. It changes the way you see the small details. And it makes every quiet moment feel more important than it first appeared. That's where we are now. Because after everything we just walked through, the rising knowledge, the restless world, the tensions between nations, the shifting spiritual landscape, the growing sense that history is accelerating, the message of Daniel was never only about predicting events. It was always about preparing hearts. Daniel didn't write from comfort. He wrote as a foreigner in Babylon, a man who had lost his homeland, his language, and nearly his identity. And yet what he saw wasn't just the rise and fall of kingdoms. He saw something deeper. He saw that every empire in history, no matter how powerful, was temporary. And more importantly, he saw that human beings have always faced the same decision when those empires begin to shake. Where do you place your trust? The quiet truth behind all prophecy. If prophecy were only about disasters, it would leave us with fear. But if prophecy is about direction, then it leaves us with responsibility. Daniel's visions didn't end with destruction. They ended with restoration. They didn't end with chaos. They ended with a kingdom that outlasts all others. And that changes everything about how we hear the story. Because suddenly, prophecy isn't just about what will happen out there in the world. It becomes about what happens inside us while the world changes. That's the part many people miss. We tend to imagine the end of history as something loud and dramatic. Wars, signs in the sky, global upheaval. But Scripture often shows something quieter happening at the same time. Hearts being revealed, loyalties becoming clear, faith either deepening or fading. Daniel understood this personally. When the king demanded worship, Daniel had to choose. When the decree forbade prayer, Daniel had to choose. When the lion's den opened, Daniel had already chosen long before. The real story wasn't the miracle. The real story was a decision that came before it. History as a story, not just a timeline. One of the biggest mistakes people make when reading prophecy is treating it like a puzzle. They try to line up dates, decode symbols, and map every headline onto a verse. But Daniel's visions were never meant to turn people into analysts. They were meant to turn them into witnesses. Because the Bible doesn't present history as random. It presents history as a narrative. There's a beginning, there's a tension, and there's a resolution that has been quietly approaching from the very first pages of the Bible. Daniel simply pulled back the curtain long enough for us to glimpse the direction the story is moving. And if the story has direction, then our lives are not accidents within it. That's what makes this message feel personal instead of distant. You are not just watching history happen. You are living inside it, the moment between prophecy and response. There's a phrase that appears again and again throughout Scripture. Those who have ears, let them hear. It's a reminder that truth isn't only about information. It's about recognition. Two people can hear the same message. One shrugs and moves on. The other feels something awaken inside them. Daniel's writings have always created that dividing line. Some read them as ancient literature. Others read them as a warning light flashing across time. And that dividing line doesn't happen because of intelligence, education, or background. It happens because of openness. Because prophecy at its core is an invitation. Not an invitation to panic. Not an invitation to speculate endlessly. But an invitation to step back and ask a deeper question. If history really is moving somewhere, what kind of person do I want to be when it arrives there? The kingdom that doesn't rise like others. All through Daniel's visions, kingdoms rise the same way. They grow from power. They expand through influence. They defend themselves through force. But the final kingdom he describes arrives differently. It isn't built by armies. It isn't sustained by politics. It doesn't need borders, treaties, or propaganda. It spreads quietly at first, then steadily, then completely. Later in the New Testament, this kingdom is described not as something visible on a map, but something that begins within people. It's the same kingdom associated with the message of Jesus Christ, a kingdom that starts in the human heart and eventually reshapes the world. That idea flips our expectations upside down, because instead of asking, when will this kingdom appear, the question becomes, has it already begun in me? Why this story still matters now. It would be easy to treat Daniel as a figure locked in the past, an ancient prophet in an ancient empire, writing about events far removed from modern life. But the themes of his story feel strangely familiar today, living in a culture that pressures faith to stay private, trying to remain steady in a world that constantly shifts, wondering how to stay hopeful when global events feel overwhelming. Daniel's life speaks into all of that, not because he had special strength, not because he knew the future in detail, but because he trusted the one who stood outside of time, and that trust allowed him to live with calm in the middle of uncertainty. That's the part of the story that matters most for us now, because we don't actually need to know every future event to live faithfully in the present. We just need to know where the story is heading, the invitation hidden in the ending. If you notice, the book of Daniel doesn't close with a detailed map of the future. It closes with a reassurance. Daniel is told to go his way, to rest, and trust that in the end, things will be set right. That's not just a message for him. It's a message for every reader who comes after. It's a reminder that history is not spiraling out of control. It's unfolding according to a plan larger than any one generation. And if that's true, then our role isn't to control the outcome. Our role is to choose how we live while the story unfolds. Do we live with fear or with faith? Do we live chasing temporary kingdoms or building our lives on something that lasts? Those questions don't belong only to prophets or theologians. They belong to everyone, to you, to me, to every person trying to make sense of this moment in history. The story continues, and so does our part in it. Right now, somewhere in the world, another generation is growing up hearing these same ancient words. Some will ignore them. Some will debate them. Some will quietly carry them in their hearts for years before they understand what they mean. That's how stories like this work. They don't end when the book closes. They continue each time someone listens. And maybe that's why Daniel's message has never disappeared. Because deep down, people still sense that history isn't random. They sense that meaning exists. They sense that the world is moving towards something, even if they can't yet explain what it is. Daniel simply gave language to that feeling. And now the story rests for a moment in our hands, not to solve, not to predict, but to respond to. Because one day, History will reach its final chapter, and when it does, the question won't be whether the prophecies were correct. The question will be where we chose to stand while they were unfolding. And that decision, more than anything else, is what turns an ancient prophecy into a living story.